series. But few people outside the DEA really understood the consequences of this shift. Soon, tons of P2P meth were moving north without any let-up, and the price of meth collapsed. But there was more to the story than higher volume. Ephedrine meth tended to damage people gradually, over years. With the switch over to P2P meth, that damage seemed to accelerate, especially damage to the brain. One night in 2009, in Temecula, California, partway between San Diego and LA, a longtime user of crystal meth named Eric Barrera felt the dope change. Barrera is a stocky ex-Marine who'd grown up in the LA area. The meth he had been using for several years by then made him talkative and euphoric, made his scalp tingle. But that night, he was gripped with paranoia. His girlfriend, he was sure, had a man in her apartment. No one was in the apartment, she insisted. Barrera took a kitchen knife and began stabbing a sofa, certain the man was hiding there. Then he stabbed a mattress to tatters, and finally he began stabbing the walls, looking for this man he imagined was hiding inside. That had never happened before, he told me when I met him years later. Barrera was hardly alone in noting a change. Gang member friends from his old neighborhood took to calling the meth that had begun to circulate in the area around that time weirdo dope. Barrera had graduated from high school in 1998 and joined the Marine Corps. He was sent to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where he was among the few non-white Marines in the platoon. The racism he felt was threatening and brazen. He asked for a transfer to Camp Pendleton in San Diego County and was denied. Over the next year and a half, he said it got worse. 2 years into his service, he was honorably discharged. After the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, Barrera was filled with remorse that he hadn't stuck it out in the Corps. He was home now, without the heroic story he'd imagined for himself when he joined the Marines. The way he tells it, he drank and used meth to relieve his depression. He'd sometimes stay up on meth for 4 or 5 days, and he had to make excuses for missing work. But until that point, he'd held his life together. He worked as a loan processor, then for an insurance company. He had an apartment, a souped-up Acura Integra, a lot of friends. But as the meth changed around 2009, so did Barrera's life. His cravings for meth continued, but paranoia and delusions began to fill his days. Those feelings of being chatty and wanting to talk go away, he told me. All of a sudden you're stuck and you're in your head and you're there for hours. He said strange things to people. He couldn't hold a job. No one tolerated him for long. His girlfriend, then his mother, then his father kicked him out, followed by a string of friends who had welcomed him because he always had drugs. When he described his hallucinations, my friends were like, I don't care how much dope you got, you can't stay here. By 2012, massive quantities of meth were flowing into Southern California. That same year, 96% of meth samples tested by DEA chemists were made using the P2P method. And for the first time in more than a decade of meth use, Barrera was homeless. He slept in his car and for a while in abandoned houses in Bakersfield. He was hearing voices. A Veterans Affairs psychologist diagnosed him with depression and symptoms of schizophrenia. Even many years later, when I spoke with him, Barrera didn't know how the drug he was using had changed and spread, or why. But as a resident of Southern California, he was among the first to be affected by it. Over the next half-dozen years or so, the flood of P2P meth would spread east, immersing much of the rest of the country too. Mention drug running, and many people will think of cartels. Yet over the past decade, meth's rising availability did not result from the dictates of some underworld board of directors. Something far more powerful was at work, particularly in the Sinaloa area, a massive, unregulated free market. By the time Eric Barrera's life began to collapse, Something like a Silicon Valley of meth innovation, knowledge, skill, and production had formed in the states along Mexico's northern Pacific coast. The deaths of kingpins who had controlled the trade in the early 2010s had only accelerated the process. When the control vanishes, all these regional fiefdoms spring up, said a DEA supervisor who pursued Mexican trafficking organizations during these years. He, like some other DEA agents I spoke with, asked that his name not be used because of the dangerous nature of his work. We just started seeing more and more labs springing up everywhere. The new labs weren't all as enormous as the Querétaro lab that Bozenko had seen in 2011, but they multiplied quickly. Beginning in about 2013 and continuing for the next several years, meth production expanded geometrically. The labs just escape all limits, a member of the Sinaloan drug world told me. In a 5 square kilometer area outside Culiacan, Sinaloa's capital city, there were like 20 labs. No exaggeration. You go out to 15 kilometers, there's more than 100. Listening to traffickers on wiretaps, one DEA agent told me, made it clear just how loose the confederations of meth suppliers were by then. The cartels had not vanished, and many of these suppliers were likely paying one or another of them off. But the wires nonetheless revealed a pulsing ecosystem of independent brokers, truckers, packagers, pilots, shrimp boat captains, mechanics, and tire shop owners. In the United States, the system included meat plant workers, money wiring services, restaurants, farm foremen, drivers, safe houses, and used car lots. The ecosystem harnessed the self-interest of each of these actors, who got paid only when deals got done. We waste hours listening on the wire, the agent told me, to people wasting their time calling around doing the networking as brokers, trying to set up drug deals because they wanted to make money. There's a huge layer of brokers who are the driving force in Mexican drug trafficking. Maybe they own a business or a restaurant in Mexico or in the US. This is something they do to supplement income. A large percentage of drug deals at this level don't happen, but it's like salesmen. The more calls you make, the more people you know, the more sales you get. So 4 or 5 people will be involved in getting 50 kilos to some city in the United States. This guy knows a guy who knows a guy who has a cousin in Atlanta. And with the independent transporters operating at the border, there's no cartel allegiance. They're all just making money. From 2015 to 2019, the Mexican military raided some 330 meth labs in Sinaloa alone. But arrests were rare, according to a person involved in targeting the labs. Far from being a deterrent, the raids showed that no one would pay a personal price, and more people entered the trade as a result. At one point in 2019, DEA intelligence held that, despite all the raids, at least 70 meth labs were operating in Sinaloa, each with the capacity to make tons of meth with every cook. With labs popping up everywhere, the price of a pound of meth fell to nearly $1,000 for the first time on U.S. streets by the late 2010s, a 90% drop from a decade earlier in many areas. Yet traffickers' response to tumbling prices was to increase production, hoping to make up for lower prices with higher volume. Competition among producers also drove meth purity to record highs. Pot was part of this story too. As some American states legalized marijuana, Mexican pot revenue faltered. Many producers switched to making meth and found it liberating. Marijuana took months to grow, was bulky, and could rot. But with crystal meth, the member of the Sinaloan drug world told me, in 10 days, you've made it. It's not as bulky as pot, so in 2 weeks you're crossing the border with it. Within 2 or 3 months, you're big. In the Southwest, the drug quickly became more prevalent than ever, and supply kept flowing east, covering the country in meth all the way to New England, which had almost none before the mid-2010s. Since late 2016, the Midwest and South have seen an especially dramatic shift. Mexican traffickers have never been able to get their hands on enough ephedrine to cover those regions. But now that was no longer an issue. In place after place, they made alliances with local dealers to introduce their product. The Louisville, Kentucky area is one example. For years, Louisville had a paltry meth market. A pound of it sold for $14,000. Then Wiley Greenhill went to prison. Greenhill was a minor drug dealer in Detroit who had come to Louisville in 1999, attracted by Kentucky's vibrant street market for pain pills, which were fetching 5 times what they sold for in Detroit. He eventually landed at the Rotorua Correctional Complex, north of Louisville, where he struck up a friendship with an inmate from California. The inmate's father, a businessman from Southern California named Jose Prieto, had gone into debt with the wrong people from Sinaloa. The Sinaloans told Prieto that to settle his debt, he had to sell their meth. Greenhill was given the opportunity to buy it. By 2016, Greenhill was out of prison, and the meth began to flow. At first, Prieto sent small quantities through the mail. Soon the loads reached 50 to 100 pounds a month, driven east by women Greenhill hired. Prieto